The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the Tax Return Seminar for International Students. My name is Rick Griffith. I'm a senior tax consultant with the IRS. I've been working with the taxes for international students for approximately the last 30 years, so I have little experience in this area. I might say that we're doing this presentation a little different than we have in the past. For years, the tax returns for international students had to be prepared on paper and sent to the IRS as a paper copy. In the last 2 years, the IRS has began accepting electronic filing for international students for the 1040NR series forms. And so last year they started the process, and this year they've completed it by adding countries with tax treaties to it, so we can fully e-file tax returns for non-resident students. Now, to do this, we use software, of course, to prepare the returns. This has greatly improved the preparation of tax returns. Is much, much easier. The software does a lot of the work for you. It will, after you enter the information, it will it will calculate the return. It will pass information from one form to the other. And so the work that the tax preparer has to do is much, much less. And it also guides you through the return so that it's kind of intuitive on what you need to put in next. Although we'll be showing, you still need to have some idea of where you're going in the return. I'll show you a few features for that too. Now, this course is assuming that you have gone through the advanced course for residents on Lincoln Learn and passed the test, and also the foreign student lessons or course on Lincoln Learn and passed the test. So you should have a fairly good idea of the tax law basics. Now, this course that we're going to do today is different from the Lincoln Learn course in that I'm going to be concentrating mainly on what the software looks like when you're doing a return. So I want you to know what to expect, what you're going to be seeing, and so that you'll be better prepared to enter the information and go through the tax return. For instance, there's a 1040NR return that any non-resident can prepare, and then there's a 1040NREZ. That's a shorter form that is usually used for the students. However, in our case, it makes no difference. The software will determine that for us. Now, the tax preparation software we're using is from a company called TaxSlayer. The TaxSlayer software prepares the return, even though it's a 1040EZ type of return, but it formats it into a 1040NR. And once we're finished with the return, we can actually see a picture of the return, review the return. But what you'll be seeing is a 1040NR. By the way, NR is non-resident return, because as of right now, the IRS only accepts the 1040NR returns. So the TaxSlayer software basically reformats the EZ into the NR format, and it's transparent to you, the tax preparer. Okay, one other thing I want to mention is that at your site you should have a publication 4011. It's the Foreign Student Resource Guide. This guide is very helpful in a number of different ways. For one, it has a scope chart that tells you what items we are allowed in the VITA program to prepare for foreign students. There are some items that are more complex that we will not be covering, and we will not prepare returns for those because primarily we have not been trained in that area. Uh, so unless you've been trained in the area, uh, it's what we call out of scope. And so you're not allowed to do those certain subjects of the text. And this would include something more advanced like investments and self-employed foreign students, which normally there won't be because they're not allowed to. If they do so, they're probably in uh, uh, it's not, well, it goes against the terms of their visa. So they're in a violation of their visa in that particular case. We'll normally not do those type of returns. Anyway, the desk guide also covers, it has some decision trees on who is non-resident, who is not, um, who or who may not claim dependents, and almost all non-residents cannot claim dependents except for about 3 or 4 countries. Also, it will, perhaps the best feature of the 4011, it will list all the income tax treaties uh, for income and for scholarships that you will need, and it will also cite the references, the treaty references that you will need to enter on the form. And that's for countries who have uh, student benefits through the income tax treaty with the United States. Okay, on the next slide, again, we have a limited scope. We don't do this for any non-resident. This is mainly for students who are on F1 or J1 visas who have been in the United States for 5 years or less, which is normally the term of a F1 or J1 student visa. Also, we will be doing some returns for we call they're teachers, scholars, researchers, possibly research assistants. We normally refer to them as scholars on a J1 visa who have been here in the U.S. for 2 years or less. So those are the two types that we'll be dealing with. There are many other types of visas. Uh, there may be a Q or M visa that's also for students, but those are very rare. And you may have things like H-1B visas, so forth. That normally, if they have those visas, it's out of the scope of this course, and they also may be resident. Okay, the next slide, again, I'm just talking about that the Link and Learn course and this course will differ some because we're following the mechanics of the software so that you're seeing the actual screenshots of what the software looks like, what you need to enter, and go from there. Okay, when you're in the software, you'll have to have some idea. The software will pretty well guide you through the process, but there may be times that you need to edit something. You need possibly you need to go back and review something, or you just want to skip ahead and see what the return's looking like now in the summary section. There's a net once you get into a tax return, and we'll show you how to do that in just a moment. There will be a navigation bar on the left side of the screen, and you can click on any of those topics to take you into the different sections of the tax return. Now, when we get into what the second item that's called the federal section. Now, each of these sections will normally have many subsections. And for instance, the federal section will have sections on income, adjustments, deductions, credits, other forms, payments, and so forth. So these are broad topics that you see here. So let's get started. The site coordinator will assign you a username and assist you with logging into the software. You will have to come up with your own password. All tax preparation software in the United States today have adopted a security measure to help prevent identification theft. So they require what we call multi-factor authentication. Primarily, you will enter your password information, but you will also have to list a phone number or email address. And I would strongly suggest that you use a text message for your phone number, and that they will send you an authentication code to enter in, and then you can log into the software. That once you do that, it's valid for a 15-day period. So about every couple of weeks, you're going to have to do it again. But like I said, all software in the United States today uses this method. The other thing that, other than logging into the software, again, getting ready to get started, all taxpayers coming to the VITA sites should be filling out the form 13614NR. It's what we call an intake sheet. It's at least a couple of pages long, on front and back, that asks many questions that the taxpayer should fill out first before you start preparing the return. It'll be things like their name, the date of birth, the address, their type of visa, their passport number, and then do they receive income from wages? Do they have other income? What country are they from? Do they have any other special circumstances? And you'll review the sheet with them. If they're unsure about an item, you will make sure that the answer is either yes or no, not the unsure category. Again, this is for foreign students. Many foreign students have never seen or ever heard of a tax return. And so you, as a trained individual, will need to explain some of the terms, the terminology, and so forth to the taxpayers to see whether they meet the criteria for that particular item or not. So after reviewing the intake sheet, make sure everything's either a yes or no, not sure. We have to make sure that the taxpayer is still within the valid time frame of their visas, 5 years for students, 2 years for scholars. We'll get into more of that in just a moment. So we'll click, you should be at the first screen of the software. You click create a new return. Now, if for some reason it's a returning client or you need to look back on the return, there will be a client list that you can search, which is the other button on that particular page. I did not show a picture of that because it's very clear once you see the screen. Okay, basic information, and there's a section on that. The software always starts a return by you entering in the social security number or ITIN number of the student. It will ask you to enter this information twice to ensure it is correct, because all returns are sorted and kept and stored and so forth based on this number. So this has to be correct. Once you've entered the number, just click continue. Now, any TaxSlayer will save any information you have input uh, after you've clicked continue. There will be a green continue button at the right hand corner of every screen there is in TaxSlayer. But once you hit continue, TaxSlayer has saved that information. So if your computer crashes or possibly the internet goes down or TaxSlayer goes down, anything that you've done up until the last time you clicked continue will be saved. So if you get into an emergency situation like that, when you pull the tax return back up, you only have to put in any information you entered after you had last clicked continue, which should be very, very small. It's a great system to save all that information so you don't have to restart a return. Okay, the software will next take you to a screen entitled Filing Status, and we'll look at that in a moment. You'll click the last entry on that screen that says non-resident alien, and we'll see that on the next slide. Now, once you've clicked that, kind of stop doing the return for just a moment, because we need to find out some information before we go any further. We must determine if the taxpayer has a filing requirement. They may not even need to file a tax return, but generally that won't be the case, because in the case of foreign students, all students on the F1, J1 visa and scholars must do one form, Form 8843. And this is what that screen looks like. It says, what's your filing status? And then, as you may have learned from your resident advanced course, you have categories of single, married filing, joint, married filing, separate. And we click the last one that says non-resident. Now, that will automatically tell the software that this is a 1040NR or non-resident return. So many of our screens from here on will look a little bit different from what the resident tax preparers would see. Like I said, we're going to stop at this point because we're needing to find out what forms and whether they actually need to file a return. Now, you've learned in your course, they talked about something called the substantial presence test. This is a test that once they've been here beyond their treaty period, which is generally 5 years for students, 2 years for scholars, then they'll be subject to the substantial presence test. And once if they do pass that test, then they become resident for tax purposes. They'll file their returns just like any other U.S. citizen or resident. And in that case, they will not do an NR return at all. So if that's the case, you would refer those individuals to the regular VITA tax site to have their returns completed. If they have not met that test, then we will be doing a 1040NR tax return for those students. Now, we may not have to do a tax return, but we do need to file one form. They must file at least one form with the IRS, and that's a Form 8843. The title of it is Statement for Exempt Individuals and Individuals with a Medical Condition. That's a very long title. And for our purposes, we can ignore the part that says individuals with a medical condition, because we're only interested in exempt individuals. You've learned in your foreign student course that an exempt individual is a person that is exempt from the substantial presence test. In other words, you're still within your 5-year period on your visa. You haven't gone beyond that. You don't have to do the substantial presence test to determine if you're non-resident or not. In this case, where you're still exempt, you have to do the Form 8843 and send that into the IRS. Now, that may be all you have to do, but we'll look a little bit further. Possibly you'll have some income, possibly some taxable scholarships, or possibly even treaty benefits that we'll need to do a 1040NR form. Here's a brief look at the Form 8843 in paper format. We'll be looking at this a little bit later, but when you see the information for it on the software, it'll be just a series of questions. You will not be looking at a form like this filled out until you go into the summary section and preview the tax return. Okay, we know we have to do the 8843 if you're on an FJ visa, and now we have to determine if you even have to file a 1040NR or not. And for that, the following requirements are: if the student has income under $4,050, and you've learned from your advanced resident course that this is the personal exemption amount, or has no taxable scholarship, then you only need to file the 8843, and you don't have to do the 1040NR. The one exception to this is instead of only the $4,050 personal exemption, students from India get only one treaty benefit, and that is they also receive the standard deduction. Again, from your advanced resident course, the standard deduction for this year is $6,350. So that added with the personal exemption amount is $10,400 for students only from India. So if they have income of less than $10,400, they also would not need to file the 1040NR and only do the 8843. Okay, but what if you have a scholarship? Now, first of all, let's get our terminology correct. Scholarships, grants, fellowships, tuition waivers, they've got different names for the same thing. So we will just simply refer to them as scholarships. Normally, scholarships are excluded from income if you are a degree candidate and they were used for tuition, fees, books, supplies, and equipment required for your courses. Things like parking permits and other things, other fees that the students may have, do not fit this definition. Tuition waivers are generally exempt also if no work was required. I should actually say they're excluded rather than exempt from income. In addition to that, you may have a student come to you to prepare their taxes that comes from one of the countries that have income tax treaties with the United States, and that treaty has a student benefit. Not all countries do that, and we'll look at those a little bit later. Then usually a portion of the income and all of the scholarship used for any reason is excluded from income. But you must file a return with the IRS to tell us that you're taking benefit of that treaty exemption. Now, when I said scholarships used for any reason, this is not only tuition, fees, books, supplies, so forth, but also even if it's taxable uh, room and board, uh, living, or just personal expenses. Under a treaty, those also are excluded from income. And like I mentioned before, if you look at your resource guide, sometimes we call that the desk guide, uh, publication 4011, there will be a list of those countries, and a section under scholarships will show you all the countries uh, and what the treaty article is where that scholarship is being excluded from income in the United States. Okay, the other portion of scholarship or fellowships that we haven't talked about, you should have learned in your resident advanced course, uh, is that normally if you do receive a scholarship that covers your room and board or personal expenses, or possibly in exchange for teaching or research, which is providing services, then it's included in taxable income with the one exception we just seen, unless it's covered by a treaty. But for anyone else who doesn't have a treaty benefit and you get room and board or other money for uh, personal uses during the year from a school or other organization, then that is included in your taxable income. And a couple of examples of what's taxable, non-taxable. Something like a tuition waiver, it's non-taxable as long as no work is required. Room and board, that's normally taxable scholarship unless covered by a treaty. Or maybe it's a stipend for teaching or research assistants. Stipend is another name usually just for taxable wages, and that would be included in income. Okay, now we've determined whether we need to file a tax return or not. Uh, Again, if it was under the income threshold, $4,050 for most students, 10,400 for the students from India, and there was no taxable scholarship, then you probably don't have to do the 1040 NR return except for the 8843. So once we've determined whether we need to do a return or not, we can kind of continue where we left off. And we left off in the filing status section where we had clicked non-resident alien. And so now we'll go to the next page, which will actually have the filing statuses that are allowed for non-resident students. Okay, we'll look at that in just a second, but I want to add that generally, and there are always exceptions to the tax law, but generally, students are either a other non-resident single or other non-resident married. So if you're single, you're considered other non-resident single, unless you're from one of the few accepted countries, which are also listed on the next screen. Or if you're married, you're other non-resident married. Now, if you're not sure if you're married, ask your wife, and they will tell you. Otherwise, one example may be that, well, you're here in the United States studying, but your wife and children are still back in your country. Now, are you considered married? Yes. If you are legally married in any country of the world, then you are still married. So you'll need to check other non-resident married for the student. Here's an example of what the next page looks like. Again, there are a couple exceptions, and that is if you're either a single or married resident of Canada or Mexico, or a married resident of South Korea in some cases, or those are the only exceptions to the filing status. Then if you're not from Canada, Mexico, or South Korea, you'll check either other single non-resident alien or other married non-resident alien. So really there's probably only two real selections for you. Once we've done that, you notice down at the bottom of every form, there's I said it's green, but I guess it's blue, continue button. Remember, anytime we click continue, it's going to save our information for us. Okay, so back to the basic information main menu. We see we've already done the filing status category. So next we need to enter in some personal information. I won't go into too much detail on this because it's pretty clear, pretty transparent on what the questions are. You'll put in their names, address, what country they're from, the date of birth, just general what we call entity information, just information about the person. Okay, and then again, click continue. You'll go back to the basic screen one more time. And the next section is dependents or qualifying persons. Almost never do non-resident students get to claim dependents or have qualifying persons. Again, there's always exceptions, and there are a few countries that would be allowed this. There are very, very few. Again, Canada, Mexico, possibly India, or South Korea would be about the only four countries where this is possible. Also, to have a dependent, they have to be a U.S. resident or U.S. born. A non-resident person cannot be a dependent on anyone else's return. I had one case where a student was being claimed by his brother, who also lived in the same town, but his brother had become resident, and now he was trying to claim his non-resident brother on his tax return, and that's not possible. You cannot claim non-residents on a tax return as dependents. So, skipping the dependent section generally, the next section you see is 1040 NR Schedule OI. Now, that's a fairly easy acronym because it stands for OI, stands for Other Information. Okay. And here is a screenshot of the Schedule OI, and it also has several different sections that we need to fill out. The first one is general information. Now this will go into a little more detailed information than what we've put in before. Not only will it ask for address, date of birth, name, of course, and so forth, but we also have to put in some more information regarding visas, passports, passport numbers, how long you've been in the United States, what country are you from, are you a citizen of, what country are you a resident of. You may be a citizen of, say, Argentina, but you're living in Brazil and may be a resident of Brazil. So it could be different in those cases. And here's just a small portion of what that screen looks like for general information. Again, the type of 1040 NR entity is an individual in our case. Country of citizenship, country of residence, um, what type of visa, in this particular case, we'll put in non-immigrant visa, and then what visa was that? Well, in our case, it's a F1 or J1. Then there's the last question on there, have you ever applied for a green card? And then there's a number of other questions on that form that you'll need to answer, and click continue. Click continue, I'll go back to that menu screen for general for OI. And the next section is travel dates. Schedule OI. Section 2 is travel dates. And this is simply asking you what dates did the student enter or depart the U.S. in the last tax year for the year that you're preparing the return. So let's say for the year 2017, we say that we determine either from by looking at the passport or any other information. Hopefully the student has put this information on your 13614 NR intake sheet, and so the information is already there for you. You would find out that the student came to the United States December 20th of 2016. He's preparing for the spring semester at the university. And then you also find out that he left the United States on May 3rd of 2017. So he attended the spring semester of school, and then probably he went home for the summer. And then, as we show on the second line, he came back August 15th of 2017, and he stayed all the rest of the year without going back to his home country. So when on the second line where it says date departed, he didn't. So we just put NA or not N/A or not applicable is what it stands for. So it doesn't pertain to us because he did not leave the United States after that. Okay, basically, if they've entered and left maybe 2, 3, 4 times, you can, let me back up the screen, you can click this little plus sign, if you see the cursor, schedule of travel dates. It will add additional lines for you, and then if you mess up a date or something like that on any of your screens, you can go over here to the little pencil icon and click that to edit the information you've already put in. Now let's say you clicked it and you put in, for some reason your fingers weren't working correctly and you typed in 2015 instead of 16 and 17. Well, you can also go over here to this little icon of a trash can and click it. It'll completely delete that line for you. Again, this is a feature that you'll see in almost all of the forms. Okay, back to the information, basic information for the OI schedule. The third category is Schedule OI, income exempt from tax. So this only pertains to the countries that have a treaty benefit, and income is excluded. In this case, we accept India from this. It's not necessary India fill out this section. Once they've checked standard deduction in another section that we'll see, their treaty information is already entered for them. But for all other countries, you need to put in the name of the country. Then it says tax treaty article. So let's say we've got a student from South Korea, and then we would click the down arrow. A lot of these boxes will have down arrows, which are pull down menus. And if you click this and I was able to pull it down, I would see a whole list of treaty articles. Okay, which one do I use? Well, this is income from, let's say, wages. And does South Korea have a treaty benefit to exclude that? Well, go to your resource guide, the 4011, look under the income page, scroll down, and you'll probably see South Korea, and it'll probably say that we're studying or training or gaining experience, $2,000 a year can be excluded. And over to the right of that in your resource guide, we'll list the treaty article number. Now that's what you're going to be looking for when you click this pull down menu from the tax treaty article. Generally, wages will probably be something like Code 19 wages, and it'd be something like a treaty article 20 in parentheses 1 or something to that nature. Whatever's listed on the listed in the resource guide for that country, for that benefit, you'll put in the treaty article number that corresponds. Okay, I've pretty well just explained what you have to look for to exclude income for the treaty benefits. Now, the thing is, not all students will get treaty benefits. In fact, there are only 32 countries out of the 195 in the world that have student treaty benefits. So the majority of countries do not have treaty benefits, and they would not be able to exclude income, and they would not be able to exclude taxable scholarship. They would have to include it as income and pay tax on it. So there's only a small number of countries that actually have treaty benefits for students. There's also a publication 901 on the irs.gov website. You go to Forms and Publications on the internet to irs.gov, click Forms, Forms and Publications, and search for publication 901, which is the title of that publication is Tax Treaties. And here is an example picture of a page from the publication 901. Quite frankly, your student guide, student resource guide is easier to read than doing this. But in case you don't have your 4011 with you at your site at the time, you can check publication 901 online. And in this example, we have People's Republic of China. We have different income code sections, anywhere from 15 for scholarships down to 19, which is studying and training. And then down below it says compensation during training or gaining experience. That's what we'll use for the students. If you look over to the right, it says if that income is paid by any U.S. or foreign employer, then the student is entitled to exclude $5,000 per year from his total income. And we also see that that's under Treaty Article 20 in parentheses C of the Chinese-U.S. Income Tax Treaty. And so that's how we determine all this information. Again, the 20C would be in the pull-down menu on the OI when you complete that section. And in the case of China, you would have entered income exempt by treaty would have been $5,000 in Treaty Article 20 in parentheses C. Okay. After we've completed the Schedule OI, click your Continue button twice and it'll take you out of the OI and back into the main section. And the next section that will pop up to bring you to is the income section. Okay, we're not going to be doing much with this section. Really, the only thing that we'll be entering is wages that the student has from the W-2 form. So the W-2 information is filled out in this section. Other types of income may be out of the scope of VITA, as I've mentioned, such as self-employment, investments, some investments, there could be multiple other types of income. You'll have to check your scope listing to see whether it's included in our VITA, included for VITA, so you can prepare the return. But generally, for our purposes, generally wages is about the only source of income, but you could have a few others. Possibly you have a student who possibly went to a casino and won some money, and the casino gave him a form, W-2G, that he needs to report to the IRS as winnings, which are taxable. And in that case, you may have to fill that out for him, but that will be in other types of income later. Okay, one thing I want to remind you from your Link and Learn course, and it's very important that you remember this for foreign students, is interest income from checking, savings, or certificate of deposit accounts, or CDs, are not taxable to non-resident students. Now, the student will probably receive a form from the bank or institution showing the amount of interest earned that year. That's fine. Have the student keep that for their records, but it is not taxable on the tax return if it's interest income. Now, all other forms of investment income probably are subject to tax. There could be a rare exception. So if they've bought some stock, they've earned dividends, or they've sold some stock and received capital gains or something like that, that generally gets a little bit beyond the scope of the VITA program. They will still have to report that on the 1040 NR, but there's many more rules in dealing with that. And here's a picture of the screenshot of the income section. And if you notice at the very top, it's wages and salaries, Form W-2. Now, one thing on wages, we could actually have Form W-2 showing wages, or we could have a Form 1042-S showing wages, or we could have both. In that case, you'll need to deal with that. We will, now these forms are prepared by the employer, and you basically just enter the information from the form into the software. And we'll be looking at the 1042-S a little bit later, Uh, there's a little more information to get on that. The taxpayer needs to have these forms with them. Uh, so you would enter the W-2 information in the W-2 screen in the software. In the past, we used to have to send the W-2 forms in with the tax return, but now that they're electronically filed, that's not necessary. First of all, let's look at a sample W-2 form. In this case, it's just an example where in box 1, it shows wages, tips, or other compensation of $6,000. And in box 2, federal income tax withheld, $540. And if you notice, that's all there is on this form. That's all there should be on this form. Box 3, 4, 5, and 6, which is Social Security wages and withholding, Medicare wages and withholding, should not be filled out because non-resident students are not subject to Social Security and Medicare taxes. Now, many employers in the United States do not know this, or they may know it, and it's just too complicated for them to try to do something different just for the foreign students. So you may have entries on these lines. That's box 3, 4, 5, and 6. If that's the case, then once we finish with the tax return, we'll need to assist the students in filling out an 843 claim form. But first they have to go back to the employer to ask the employer to refund those Social Security and Medicare wages back to them because they're F1 students or J1 and they're not subject to Social Security. And we'll look at the 843 a little bit later. So right now we're basically looking at just the wages. Here again, I said we would talk about it later, but I just want to show you a brief sample of what a 1042S looks like. You'll mainly be interested in this top part where it says income code 16, which would generally be, in this case, it's Joy Kim from South Korea, would generally be a scholarship. And then the gross income is $5,000, which could have been something like a taxable scholarship or something. However, on box 4A, it will have an exemption code. Now, if it has an exemption code of 00, it's not exempt, and it would be taxable. But in this particular case that we're looking at, on line 4A, it says exemption code 04, which means it's exempt by treaty, so that that $5,000 is not going to be entered into income of the student. There will be a 1042S form to fill out, which is fairly similar to what we're going to do next by filling out the W-2 form. Now, you start out by checking this is a standard W-2, or it's corrected if the W-2 is, well, let's say the employer corrected it and took off those Social Security wages. That would be one instance where it might be corrected. But generally, it's just a standard W-2. For the employee, it should bring in all the entity information, such as the student's address and so forth. Over to the right, you need to put in the employer's information. Now, you'll need to get this from the W-2 form. You start with the employer's EIN, which is simply employer's identification number. And you'll find this 9-digit number. You'll usually be something like 75-XXX, or 2 digits followed by seven more. It's a 9-digit number. And then the employer's name, the address, and so forth. This is just the top part of the W-2 form. Now let's look at the next section where it gets into wages. Again, we'll show wages and tips in box 1, federal tax withholding in box 2. In our case, we will never enter anything in box 3, 4, 5, or 6 for a foreign student who has not exceeded the substantial presence test, because they're not subject to that. Now, there could be information in there that we'll need to see about getting a refund of those wages later. Okay, once you've completed the W-2 form, and you just very simply transfer the information from the form to the screen. The boxes are numbered the same, so just do that likewise. Some cases you may see at the bottom of the W-2 information from state income, income tax, state income tax withheld. That would only be in cases of students who have lived and worked in another state and have now come into your university. But generally doing state tax returns is generally out of the scope for VITA. There's just too many states, too many different rules, regulations, laws that we simply don't know about. So if we haven't been particularly trained in an area, we don't do it. Okay, after the income section, we come to another section of the federal section, I should say. It's adjustments, deductions, and credits. This will be very, very limited for us, as most foreign students don't get a benefit of almost any of the adjustments, deductions, and credits. To start out with, the only adjustment to income that a foreign student is allowed is the interest on the student loan. And hopefully you've learned in your courses that if a student has a student loan and he paid interest on that student loan last year or in the year that you're doing taxes for, then they can claim the interest only, not the principal of the student loan. So if they paid interest and principal of the loan, only the interest portion can be shown as an adjustment to income. Now, the only deduction allowed is the standard deduction allowed only students from India. In this case, only the students from India would go to this section, check the little box for standard deduction, and that would be it. So that takes care of the deduction section. And when we get to credits, credits are almost never allowed foreign students. Very rare exceptions. There could possibly be a child tax credit or a child dependent care credit or daycare, only in very special circumstances, and the children would have to be had to have been born in the United States. In all those other cases, there's no other credits allowed foreign students. There's no earned income tax credit for foreign students. There's no education credits allowed for foreign students. That's only for residents or citizens. And here's a slide of the or screenshot of what the adjustments, deduction, credit section looks like for deductions. There's a tab for adjustments, one for itemized deductions, which is also where you'll find the standardized deduction for Indian students. You click that tab. And then, of course, like I mentioned, the credits menu, which foreign students almost never get to take. And here's a little further look at the deductions or itemized deductions section. And when you pull that up, it says use standard or itemized deduction. It's got a little box, a little warning box there. It says non-resident aliens cannot claim the standard deduction. However, a special rule, actually it's a treaty, applies to the students and business apprentices from India who have a tax treaty, and they can claim the standard deduction. And in the two boxes down below, it says force itemized or standard deduction, and the students from India will click standard deduction. Click continue. The next section that you get into will be the payments section. And we're only looking at this section for one thing. At the bottom of the page, it says foreign persons, U.S. source, income subject to withholding, form 1042-S. And this is where we'll input the information from the 1042-S form into the software. You click begin and go to that. Now, you notice I've got a little warning on this page that the TaxSlayer software at this point doesn't have specific guidance on entering 1042-S forms into their software. You put it in you click the tab, you put the information in, you'll show taxable wages, you'll show withholding. Now the withholding will carry over to your 1040-NR form and be included with any W-2 withholding that you may have. There's no problem there. However, the income from the 1042-S does not carry over to the 1040-NR form. So you'll have to go back to the income section of the form and manually go into the other income form and enter the information there as 1042-S and the amount of wages from the 1042-S. This will actually put this on the other income line of the 1040-NR. Although technically it would be wages, the software doesn't calculate it in that fashion yet, like the other wages from a W-2. So like I said, don't forget to manually transfer the income over to the other income section of the tax return. Hopefully, TaxSlayer will make any adjustments or improvements to this section, and the 1042-S will carry over for us automatically. But at this time, you have to do it manually. Okay, we'll click continue. We're into other forms. The only reason we're looking at this is other forms is all the way down at the bottom. You'll see exempt and individuals with medical condition, which again, we ignore the individuals with medical condition. So we're looking at exempt individuals in the form 8843. So you click that last box, and this is what the 8843 will start to look like on the screen. I'd shown you a picture of what the form looks like, but once we enter all this information in the software, we can go and review the return, and we'll see all this information is properly put on the actual tax form that we'll be looking at, and that will be transmitted to the IRS. Okay, this is going to be pretty redundant to what we've already done on the Schedule OI. It's going to ask a lot of the same information, same questions. If we look at the screenshot, type of U.S. Visa immigration status. So you have to put in your type of visa, the date you entered the United States, have you changed your visa, uh, and so forth. This is general information. Just fill all that information out. You've probably already done almost all of it before on the Schedule OI. Uh, use your 13614 NR intake sheet from the taxpayer to fill this out also. Now this is part one, general information. For students, you'll also do part three. Scholars will do part two. We're just looking at a screenshot for the students on part three. And it's going to ask you, what academic institution did you attend? So what university did you go to? What's their phone number? What's their address? Then it's going to ask you the director of academic program in which you attended. Again, it could be like the dean of engineering, the dean of the business school, or if they don't know, just put the director of the international office on there. And again, you can just use the same phone number and address for the school, for the director as you do the school. Just fill out this information the best you can. The 8843 is actually an information return. It's not a tax return as such, so that IRS, in a sense, doesn't really process, but it is required by regulations that the 8843 be done. And you'll get the information for the 8843 like you did the OI, either from the intake form, the student's passport, or other documents they may have. And remember, this may be the only form that they have to file. Again, if their income was below the threshold or they didn't have a taxable scholarship, then they may not have to file a 1040-NR, only the 8843. Okay, once we've done that, we're almost done. So next section is completing the tax return. There will be one more section that you'll need to fill out. I think it is actually right before this section, and that's the section on health insurance coverage. There's 4 questions to that section that you'll need to fill out. It'll ask you, did you have health insurance coverage? Yes, no. Did you buy the health coverage on the marketplace? Generally, no. They'll ask you to confirm the person that's listed as having the health insurance. And I think the 4th question says, were you covered for a full 12-month period? Yes or no. Check those. It was part of the Affordable Health Care Act that it's required to be done. In some cases where someone is not covered and their income is sufficient enough that they may have to pay a penalty for not having health insurance. Probably in most cases with students, even if they did not have it, their income is probably so low that they would be exempt anyway. So when we get to this completing the tax return, it's almost complete, not quite. We can go on down. We're not going to add any state tax returns because they're out of scope. We can go back to the federal section if we need to check on something. Maybe we missed something. Maybe we need to review or edit parts of it. Then click on Continue to Summary. Uh, Now this is going to show you a summary of the calculations uh, from the form. And at the top, and I'll show the screen in just a second, at the top of the right hand, at the top of the summary page, you can click View Print. And what will pop up is an actual PDF of what the actual tax return on the actual tax forms will look like. And this is a good place to look over some of your work and see if you entered in all the information that you should. And like I mentioned, to make sure that we're finished, make sure you've answered the questions on the healthcare coverage. And then when you've done that, you'll click Save and Exit, and indicating that the return is now complete for review. Generally, the site coordinator or another person will review the tax return you prepared with the taxpayer. We review 100% of returns with another set of eyes. In other words, another person will review the work that you've done on this tax return. And that person has to generally have passed the same level of expertise as you've got. Here's a picture, a screenshot of the calculation summary. We don't have any numbers on this one, but it'll show us what the taxpayer's total income is, their adjusted gross income, tax. There probably won't be any credits. It'll show the total tax amount, show their payments, which is generally their withholdings, and then whether the withholdings were enough to pay all the tax or not. In that case, you'll either owe some money or you get a refund back. Okay, once you get to this page, like I said, you'll save and exit because your return is now ready to be e-filed to the IRS. This is usually after review. We normally don't prepare the returns ready to e-file until it's been reviewed by another tax preparer or site coordinator. At that point, we are through. We can help the next person. I want to thank you for attending this seminar, and I want to thank you especially for volunteering to help the foreign students to do their taxes. This is a much different area of taxes than what's available for U.S. Residents or citizens. There are very, very few tax preparers that are actually able to help the students do these returns. Many of the schools have bought software where the students can do their own returns, but if the students don't know what they're doing, that becomes very complicated, especially when it's a different language. The tax laws can be extremely complicated, and so with you having the training and help preparing the tax return for the foreign students, it's a service that's absolutely invaluable, and we thank you for doing that.